Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you at this time of the day. I generally, when I was at university, avoided 8 a.m. classes, I can tell you that. I'd like to introduce Kristen. She is with the Olds Institute, which is a local, I'll call it an economic development organization, which consists mostly of volunteers, a few paid staff. But their primary function, at least historically, has been to promote economic development in the community. So she, on behalf of that organization here, is going to film whatever happens this morning. And that's why the release was necessary, in case it ever goes on air or something like that. Okay, just by way of my own history, so you'll know kind of my background, where I'm kind of coming from. I was born and raised in Bassano, which is a small town about 90 miles east of Calgary. My dad was in business and then bought a ranch, so we moved up to the ranch when I was in grade 9. And we had 5 sections of grass northeast of Bassano. We ran about 250 head of cows, and we had a feed lot, well which went dry, which caused the feedlot to quit, blah, blah. So you know all about, if any of you ever associate with rural living, you know how dependent you are on a well. And I can tell you from my experience, and that has really taught me a lesson in selling rural real estate. Wells are extremely important. Anyway, from Bassano, I saw that Simon Fraser was opening up a brand new campus, and it was in my last year of high school, and I thought, well, there's an opportunity, and I applied and got accepted. And one of the criteria was that you didn't have to take French, and that just suited me fine. French was not a requirement. And so I went to Simon Fraser for 4.5 years, then went to graduated. Basically in the mid-60s, there wasn't a lot of work. It was a pretty tough economic environment, so the best alternative was to stay in school, and that I did. And then I went to U of A and got my Bachelor of Education, and taught 1 year only in a school in Dutchess, Alberta, which is 10 miles north of Brooks, which was about half an hour from my hometown. And my family had roots there. My dad was born and raised in that country, so it was kind of neat. I really enjoyed it, but there was no money. I was making 2 degrees. I was making $7,500 a year, and I had an opportunity to make $1,000 a month. And it was with an organization called the Task Force on Urbanization in the Future, which had been set up by the Social Credit Administration prior to the Lougheed election in 1972. And the focus, the concept was through a participation model to examine various aspects of urbanization that were affecting the province at that time, the rapid growth of cities. And the flip side of that was the decline of smaller centers. And because of my background, I was hired to run that particular task committee. And the task force itself was run by the 10 mayors and the Minister of Municipal Affairs. So the first area chosen was Drumheller, because one of the mayors was, at that time, was from Drumheller. So my job was to go out and try and, through this model of public participation, to identify problems that communities at that time were facing, and secondly, to come up with solutions. The original intent of the task force, as envisioned by the social credit government, was to go on for 36 months, do this process, start it in the Drumheller area, and then go to another area that was facing similar problems, and see if there would be some commonality of solutions and so on. However, the Lougheed government decided that that particular model or that concept didn't fit with their plans, so instead of going for 36 months, we were cut back to 10. And the film talks about, the National Film Board had decided, and I don't know how they became aware of it, except the facts the guys who did it were from Alberta. Maybe they had heard of it somehow, I'm not sure. But anyway, they decided to film that 10-month process through a program of the National Film Board called Challenge for Change. And that's how those guys, that film crew followed us around for basically 10 months and watched, to kind of film the process as to what we were trying to accomplish. The 10 months ended obviously prematurely, at least from the communities that I was working with. We had a committee of a representative from each of the 10 towns. We met regularly. We were trying to get this process going. We were trying to involve the public in each of the communities to get them thinking about the future of their particular community, whether it was rural or urban, and try to come up with some solutions. So when it was announced that the task force was going to be shut or stopped, basically, our group, the group that I was with, the 10 mayors, decided to put in a contract proposal to the Minister of Municipal Affairs and combine it with some local money and a grant from the province to try to carry on this, something we had just started, for a year as a pilot project. And the representatives from the group met with the Minister of Municipal Affairs, Dave Russell, who was the minister at the time, and he accepted the concept. So we operated the first year with a budget of $24,000. And part of the plan was for me to, there was lots of things happening at the time that were affecting why communities were not growing and expanding. One of which was lack of information. So I scheduled myself into each of the communities at least once a month. I had a display booth set up in each of the communities showing all the government programs that were available. So part of my job was to communicate, or as I saw it anyway, was to communicate what was available in terms of senior government funding to help these towns. It could be businessmen with loans, it could be the municipality with simple infrastructure grants, like for water and sewer. A lot of the communities at that time that I was working with in that Drumheller area did not have the basics of water and sewer. So one of our concepts was to kind of treat the 10 communities as a big city. So we hired I think 6 or 8 of the communities went together and hired a common engineer to help them devise engineering studies and all the rest to help implement some of the infrastructure needs that were required. We also became aware of a federal government program called the Neighborhood Improvement Program. Sorry, the 1-year program then was extended 3 years and then went on for 17 years. So I lived in Carbon, Carolyn, my wife and I lived in Carbon for 17 years with this concept. And about the 4th or 5th year in, we became aware of a federal government program called the Neighborhood Improvement Program. The acronym was NIP, of course. And it was designed primarily in the cities to help areas in the cities that were in decline. So we pitched the federal government on the idea that these 10 communities were in fact a regional city, and that each of them was, a neighborhood of a city, and the feds bought it. So we got $7.1 million over 3 years, and each year 3 or 4 communities would go. Year 1 was 3, year 2 3, and year 4 was 4, and they shared that money equally. We didn't care about the size of the community, because a lot of grants at the time were based on population. We didn't think that was right, because the cost to put in a water treatment plant was the same whether it was Calgary or Hazard. So we didn't treat anything on a per capita basis. We tried to do everything as equal as we could to make it work. And we were successful. I mean, we successfully implemented a number of projects in those 10 towns based on that model. Another thing that we did that was kind of a neat idea was the concept of a local development company. And a local development company was simply a mechanism, it was actually a co-op, that for a very simple, I think it was $5 to register as a co-op at that time, and we sold shares in individual local development cooperatives in each of the towns, and we used that equity to build what at the time was a real need, was spec homes. There was no homes being built in small towns because there was custom built, of course, for the more wealthy people who could afford to do it, but to put up a home on spec, the market just wasn't there. So that's exactly what we did. So in the course of the 15 years, I think it was, that we actually had these going, we built in the order of 50 homes in these 10 towns. We built them, sold them, made a bit of profit, and used that money to take it the next step to build some more. However, as some of you who may be aware, there was this ghastly federal program called National Energy Program. So in 1980-81, interest rates soared to 22%. Our spec loans, which were based on mortgages, no buyers, no money, so our local development companies concentrated on housing didn't make it. They went south. We quit claimed the homes and Alberta Housing had them. But the other thing we did with that, with some of the share capital, we borrowed money from an organization at the time called the Alberta Opportunity Company, which was a Crown corporation set up by the Lougheed administration to fund businesses that could not get funding from, well, the most traditional form was the bank. So the criteria was you had to be turned down by a bank, and if you were turned down by a bank, there was a chance that you could get the money from the Alberta Opportunity Company. So what we did was, in the community of Trochu, for example, we took the share capital, borrowed $20,000, and bought a mobile home, which was converted into a doctor's office, because the old-time doctor there, the traditional old country doctor, had died and they didn't have medical services. So in order to attract a doctor, had to have a place for him to work. So they bought the mobile home, and as far as I know, that mobile home is still there serving in, I'm not sure if it's still a clinic, but it's still there in use. In the town of Carbon, where I was located, we used that money to build a 6-bay commercial building and leased it out to businesses that wanted to start up in the town. We built another building that was specific to a body shop. Again, borrowed the money, used local capital, borrowed the money from the Alberta Opportunity Company, built a building. The guy, in this case, the fellow came in and started a business. So that was one of the ways that we were trying to, kind of the concept is if you expect somebody else to come, you have to invest in yourself. So that was the vehicle. That was one vehicle, this notion of a local development company that was very, very successful in those small towns. And these towns were all, Hazard was at that time 170 people, and my largest town was probably Bazzano, which was right around 900 people. So these were small communities. These were not gigantic, sprawling, metropolitan areas by any sense. So go ahead.
So at that time, there was no internet, there was none of all of this technology and stuff today.
Do you remember the masts that had TV?
Yes.
The old
antennas.
The old antennas? I'll tell you a quick story about that. I remember when I very first started in real estate in '93, there was one of those big masts sticking up beside this house, and I was showing a young couple this house, and they asked me what that was for. And I had to go through the explanation. That's how we used to get television. That's how much things have changed, of course. Go ahead.
So at that time, then, how were you able to find out about all of these other programs that were being offered, either federally or provincially?
I worked a lot with the local MLAs and MPs, so I camped on their doorsteps, talked to them. I had a regular pipeline with the 3 MLAs that served that area and the 2 federal MPs. I asked them, you guys, part of your responsibility as elected members is to let us know, and through me perhaps, what's out there, what can we use? And of course you read in the papers, obviously. I heard about the neighborhood improvement program first in the Inglewood-Ramsey area of Calgary.
Really?
And I got to know the architect, or two of the fellows that were behind that. So I toured that and got more information, obviously, and we went after the program. So information was really tough. The information networks that we have now with the internet and so on just weren't there. I'm telling you, it was pretty primitive. And you had the old style television and a couple of channels,
Yeah.
CBC and two private channels, and that was it for kind of the broadcast network. Then Maclean's, some of those type magazines, Time magazine, and so on. So there wasn't a whole, and obviously the newspaper, the Calgary Herald in this case was the main newspaper. So there wasn't a lot of ways to find out information other than just digging and getting it. And that was part of my job, was to find out what was out there and make local people aware of what was available.
So networking was really important
Oh,
then.
absolutely, yeah. And I developed kind of a group of champions in each town that would, they were great help. They would help spread the word, and I got really good support from the Calgary Herald. There was a writer, and I can't think of his name right now, who did a lot of work. Part of his beat was covering what was going on in rural southern Alberta, and he was excellent. Just how he came out a number of times and did articles on the various projects that we were doing, and he helped spread the word as well. He was wonderful.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, it was. This whole process was long before internet. Let me tell you, and the availability of information was a major impediment for smaller centers.
Yeah.
So we carried on for 17 years, I think it was, and trying a whole bunch of different ideas to see what we could do to make things happen in these small towns. And I decided, my wife and I decided that 17 years was kind of enough. We had committed to ourselves that we want to give our children a good start in a smaller center. So when we moved to Olds in 1988, our children were in grade 2 and grade 6. So we felt they were well-grounded. It was our conscious decision to raise our children in a small town. We thought there was a lot of value in doing that. So I got prospected, or whatever you call it, by the town of Olds. And I came over here and applied for a job, and I became the economic director for 10 small town, or for the town of one town, Olds. I did that for 5 years, and then got right-sized or downsized, or however you want to talk about it, because at that time economic development, it was in vogue when I started. Out of the limelight in the late 88, 89, that time frame. So it seemed logical to me to go into real estate, and took the course, and 20-some years later I'm doing real estate. So the future of small towns. I see some of the main issues that George and I were talking about it just recently, that very little's changed. I mean, there's still the same battles, the forces of centralization. It used to be the grain elevator was the biggest tax generator in a small town. Most of the small towns, the elevator's gone.
Yeah.
The rail lines have been abandoned, and with the abandonment of the rail lines and that whole centralization process, many small towns lost their commercial base, which was the elevator. Combine that, then you no longer had that traffic generator, another one less reason for the farmers to come into town. It was just a compounding effect. And you combine that with school centralization, hospital centralization, that whole centralization thing where bigger is better kind of. And in most cases, a lot of the small towns just weren't able to withstand that. The town of Carbon, where we live, I believe they're down to up to grade 9 now. And so the kids to high school are bused out, leave. So, those kinds of things make it really, really tough for a community, a small town, to fight those kind of processes. I believe, and I believe that the internet will be the new information highway, which it already is. But if you think of, I equated this whole internet and the big pipe, the huge volume that ONET has. It can be very transformative for small towns, because as we had the building of the CPR, this is how I equate it. It brought the economy from east to west. Then they built branch lines, and that took the lines out to all the small towns. Every town was 10 miles apart, because that's how far farmers could haul the grain in those days. So that same branch line concept, I think, will work for the internet. And I think the information, that whole information and all the things that go along with it are one of the things that I think could be one of the saviors for smaller centers. Especially when you got the big pipe, the big pipe now, like Olds has, that's got that tremendous volume that you can live anywhere in Olds, in this case, and have access to that big internet. And I think that could, if our senior governments or the private sector or a combination thereof are willing to invest that kind of money, putting the big pipe into smaller centers, I think it could be huge returns. I mean, because as a government, if you look at it, they've already got a huge investment in these towns. They've got schools, they've got water, sewer, they've got all the basic infrastructure there, land. And if people can telecommute, for example, or if they can create some sort of an internet-based or technology-based intelligence, all that kind of stuff, I mean, as long as you have access via the internet, I think there's some real hope. And as you know, for those of you with a farm background, the forces of centralization are also very apparent in the agricultural side, with the days of the quarter section farmer, at least in this area, are just about gone. It's bigger and bigger and bigger, bigger equipment, bigger everything, bigger money. I mean, so there's lots of forces that make it tough for a smaller center. But I think the willingness to survive, the willingness to work with one another, the willingness to pool resources may be a savior. So, I'm open for questions.
Do you think there'd be any impact if they developed a rapid transit line between Calgary and Edmonton with stops? You know how the old Greyhound used to do the milk run? If they did something similar, would that help kind of connect the smaller communities?
That becomes an urban transportation system.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for the money they'd spend on that, I would like to see them take that money and put the internet into, get that branch network of the information highway out there, as opposed to a physical transportation system. That's my own kind of prejudice, but because I fought this battle for 50 years, and to me, you go on the QE2 now. I know it's an urban road. It's packed, and I guess from the perspective of the population centers in Calgary and Edmonton, it would make sense to have some form of rapid transit, but it would still bypass most of the small towns, I suspect. I don't think it would stop too often. That's my guess. Maybe I'm wrong. But pardon me. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
We've been talking about the expansion of small towns and how first land that gets taken is agricultural land for development oftentimes. Do you see at all any switch in, or any more acceptance of like multifamily units versus the ideal single family home? Is it still the prime goal of most families to live in a single family dwelling and want to get their little acreage, or at least their yard?
Well, I read a stat yesterday. I think almost, sorry, I thought I shut my phone off.
We do the same thing.
I saw a stat yesterday that almost 10% of the population lives in a condominium in Canada. So that suggests to me that the notion of, some sort of apartment style or that condominium style of living is becoming more and more prevalent because it's affordable. The development of land from a municipal perspective, as I see it, it's based on density. So the more, the traditional 60 by 120 foot lot, they're now getting shrunk to 45 foot lots, 30 foot lots, so that you can have more people per square meter, well in this case per acre, or developmental acre. I think the norm used to be 4 lots per acre. Now it's getting 5, 6, that kind of thing, because the costs of servicing are so expensive. I think there's a recognition on the part of the rural municipalities that once that 6 inches or 8 inches or a foot of topsoil around like Olds is gone, once that gets built on, it's gone. It's out of production. So there's always going to be that dichotomy of thought. What's better, to leave it as productive land or develop for residential purposes. So it's a philosophical debate that I think will be ongoing.
In that National Board of Canada's film,
NFB.
yeah, there was a comment made about doorstep trade. What was that?
In a lot of businesses on Main Street, Alberta, wherever they are, have historically depended on doorstep trade, which means that people just by nature just stop do business with them, and they depended on just having their doors open from 9 till 6 or whatever it is, and people would just automatically stop and shop at their store. That doorstep trade is increasingly vanishing because of the internet,
Yeah,
primarily Amazon.
yeah,
I remember when we did all our shopping with Eaton's catalog.
Yeah.
And those are gone, those are history. Well, just like the Sears store now.
Yeah.
So that's my interpretation of what the doorstep trade is, because it's forcing small business people to have an internet presence. And I think one of the things that the Olds Institute is doing is trying to get more businesses on the net, so that they can merchandise and market through the internet. Yeah, I imagine. I mean, Amazon is such a huge presence, and now we see there's 250 municipalities in North America fighting against each other for the Amazon investment.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we fought in 1970. I mean, that historic conflict between municipalities to get investment, we tried to minimize that and say, as long as the investment happened in the region, everybody wins.
So from a collective perspective.
Correct. Sound a bit socialistic or communistic, but
Yeah.
it was the only way to survive.
Yeah.
And now we see it, you can see it in the paper now with Amazon. How municipalities, they're willing to give away tax. I mean,
Yeah.
I guess obviously the theory is that all the spin-offs will be created by a company like Amazon, for employment, for all the support infrastructure and jobs, the whole bit.
We recently had a chance to go to a planning workshop, and one of the planners for the city of Edmonton was there. So we kind of got on the topic of preserving ag land, and kind of asked the question of I guess, what's the city's responsibility or view to preserving that ag land, and basically the answer that came back was, well, if a developer comes to us and they want to build houses, we're basically going to we're going to approve it, and that's that.
As long as it meets the planning requirements.
Right. They didn't really seem to care one way or another if it was taking the ag land or not. It just seemed to be, you know, shuffled under the rug. I guess do you have any thoughts on that, on like maybe what cities should be doing differently or changing, or is it just simply a mindset, or are they just simply responding to what the public wants?
You know, a lot of development is driven by the developers. So until the municipality is able to have stricter controls, you know, have more strict rules maybe or something, maybe they would have to, well, I'll use Olds as an example. I live in the southwest quadrant. Our house here in Olds backs onto a field. It's in the lake area. I don't know if any of you have been out there, but we're not on the lake, but we're across the street from the lake, and our house backs onto a field. Now that half section has been bought by developers. That was bought, I would say 10 years ago. They paid $40,000 an acre for 2/4 of land. They sold partnership units to people at $15,000 for 1/4 an acre. So they bumped it from 40 to 60,000 an acre without doing a thing. The concept was, we'll do all the planning hoops, we'll make it, and you'll triple or whatever the amount of money you make. However, they didn't take into account the nosedive in the economy. So that land is still sitting there. There's an area structure plan done. It's tremendous land. It is really productive land. You know, that topsoil is, God, it's a foot thick or more. So it is really good land. It's very productive, but developers bought it. They drove the process, and the town, I mean, had been annexed, and it was designated for residential. So from a municipal point of view, what were they to do? I mean, they approved it. Instead of the taxes now, they go to the town of Olds as opposed to the rural municipality. So that didn't change the taxation level. It's just that as you said, they've taken. I mean, that's going to be residential land, and 6 inches of topsoil land or more is gone. It'll be out of service, except to be a garden or somebody's grass. But people need a place to live, so it's a real conundrum. Just go ahead.
Do you think that towns should be doing more to protect like local businesses?
Well, if you mean by protect, you mean limiting competition?
Yeah, like allowing like a Walmart or something to
Which
come
they
in.
did here.
Yeah.
Well, there's two sides to that. If you limit competition, then you're not really helping the consumer. You may be protecting your business, but your local business, but you're not helping the consumer. That's one side of it. The Walmart development in Northwest Olds, I remember the process. I was in real estate, am in real estate, and was at the time. There was several public meetings, and I think the advantage of a cornerstone, which includes Walmart type development, is with that mass of the big box stores, it drives traffic. So for the Main Street businesses, or uptown as it's called here, they need to take advantage of that traffic that's generated. So if they're coming to Walmart, you got to market yourself downtown as the next step. When you're at Walmart, come downtown, and because we got all these very unique stores and so on. So you got to take advantage of the traffic that they generate. I think that's the upside. That doorstep trade, that's another way of encouraging more. It's not doorstep, but it's new trade. I think the other thing that communities have to do, and I think that's one of the challenges of the Olds Institute, is to market our town. We have this huge investment in ONET, which is a gigabit of internet service to any business in town, if they want to pay for it, that is. We got to take advantage of that. We got to sell that concept to the world. That's our leg up of all of the communities along the corridor. That's the leg up in my mind. I mean, we got wonderful location. We got the mountains, blah blah. Everybody can say they got mountain view, but we have own it, which is the fastest internet in Canada in a small town. So we got to take advantage of it.
Just from an environmental perspective, like obviously from back in the days when you were starting that task force, talking about the environment probably wasn't the same as how it's talked about now. It's all fine and good that we talk about it and everybody wants to do their little part, but at the end of the day, it always seems to be the last priority, and it always seems to be, well, the environment's all fine and good, but if you have money, you could just pay extra and forget about the environment. Things like putting roads through wetlands and developers, filling in wetlands and stuff. Those things happen all the time, even though we have rules to protect against that stuff. So do you see that ever changing, or is it always going to be money over everything?
Well, as an example, one of the major issues in the 60s and early 70s, and it involves the environment, an environmental concern, is how do you get rid of solid waste? How do you get rid of garbage? So we had a task committee. One of the tasks of a group of towns in the Calgary and Edmonton area, they looked at the whole notion of how do you effectively handle garbage. So it was the environment in the broader sense was recognized at that time, yes, and they made recommendations I know there was a movement towards centralized landfills and that sort of thing. But to answer so it was the environmental concerns were there, in that time frame. The notion of greenhouse gas emissions and going through wetlands, and I think it was there. I think there was concern whether municipalities were to effectively deal with it. That's debatable. It's tough. It's particularly in a really small towns, towns smaller than Olds, for example. If you have a developer, if you're fortunate enough, it depends how you look at it, to get a developer come in and wants to develop some land, and he happens to affect a wetlands, for example. I mean, you weigh that against the economic benefits for a small town, that could be huge tax assessment. So it's a tough struggle, the money versus quality of life and environment and all the rest of the factors.
So I guess follow-up question would be then is how much responsibility is really on the shoulders of the municipality, the city, what have you, to do what's right and not always what's profitable?
Well, it's all
right. So money wins, right?
in a lot of look at Energy East. Montreal killed it, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
money doesn't always win. Obviously, I'm showing my political.
What's the chances of that ever changing?
I don't know. I think it'll rest with your generation. The more that the environmental consciousness is raised, the more and your generations gets more politically and socially and active. Those philosophies will change, because my generation and our views are dying out. Does that answer your question? What were you wanting me to say?
No, it answers it, but then it spikes a whole bunch of other questions. Because as a newcomer, so I'm from Airdrie, and they just recently created this 50-year plan for the annex land around it, and I am by far the youngest one on the committee that has a say in what's going on this land by probably 30 years. Nobody listens. I get pushed to the back, and understandably, because I am the youngest one. But even though I'm going to school for stewardship and what we're talking about, it seems like there's just no hope. Until you get an entirely new set of office in there, or there's more kids or young adults my age for the next 50 years, like the majority of the land surrounding Airdrie is wetland area, and although we're not technically allowed to touch it, even talking to the people, they're like, well, you know, we can just create that somewhere else, or I have money so I can buy it. Like as Chris said, money wins.
Well, I guess all of us, my generation, is putting our hopes in your generation to fix things.
Yeah.
But you have to remember that money doesn't grow on trees. I mean, you have to invest money to make money. And developers, I mean, when you look at, they're looking at their bottom line. And if it's acceptable to the municipality, who's the approving authority, then I guess, and until that changes with the influence of people of your generation and the social mores and so on change, then yeah, you're right, probably won't change. But you have to.
Could be a bit more stubborn.
Yeah, well, and I
Loud
think you have to make your case.
Yeah. Okay.
And yeah, sure, you'll be put down because you're young. I was put down because I was young and stupid in 1970 as well. Nobody thought, they thought I was crazy.
Yeah.
But I'd grown up in a small town and pushed. I really had strong feelings about the survival of the smaller centers. So I think if you exhibit those kind of stubbornness, then there's hope.
Bring it on.
Bring it on, yeah. Exactly. I mean, it's a challenge. I mean, the reason I suspect this group are in this program is that you're all, or some of you at least, are very conscious of all of these kinds of concerns, and you need to see those concerns addressed, in the administrative sense in whatever community you choose to live in. That's the challenge.
Yeah.
That's the challenge for change.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else?
I went to a planning conference in Niagara Falls last weekend, and saw a different perspective than rural Alberta. But one thing that really stood out to me was this trying to find a balance and trying to figure out what's right between development and keeping things the way they are, or putting more into the environment. One of the issues that they're facing right now, they've got 3 hotels that they built there. 2 of them are 35 stories high, and one of them is 56 stories high. The land that has been set aside for these 3 hotels is like prime land, right by the falls. And they're facing the challenge then, well, one hotel room basically produces one job. So they've got 400. I think you said about 1,400 hotel rooms would be included in these 3 hotels. So you've got a community where there's
Tourism is the major focus,
big.
probably.
That's what's drawing people there. They've got people who are unemployed. They see this opportunity. Is it going to get approved or not? Like, what are you going to do? It's not just a black and white issue. There's a lot involved. They had the one place where they did stick to their guns. Their bylaw said that the hotels had to be 25 meters apart, and the proposed plan was they were only 14 meters apart. And so council did actually reject the first plan, and they had to come back with a 25-meter setback between the hotels. So that was a little bit of a minor victory, but still, just it made me realize that it's not just black and white. It's not just you can't just look at it through an environmental lens or through a money lens. You gotta, like you said, weigh the benefits and try to figure out the best route. Be willing to do some compromising, and maybe the first plan that's presented isn't the right one, but something can be found that will be suitable, and be more of a win-win.
Well, to use Olds as an example, and this is where this young lady, your influence would come in. Make sure they can't get around it. In Olds, the height of buildings is restricted by how far the fire ladders can go. So that's why there's no building in Olds over 4 stories. So if you want to protect, what's going around, you limit the height of buildings in this case through just simple fire protection.
So we were talking about how some cities are starting to grow up rather than out.
Density, yeah.
And you were saying that 10% of people in Alberta, Canada now live in condos. You think that's going to keep trending?
I certainly see there's more and more, particularly adult condominiums being built in Olds, for example. So using that as an indicator, plus the number of duplexes in town. There's a development in Southwest Olds called Destination Place, and those homes are the classic 2-story homes, single on a 30-foot lot, starter homes. You're going to see more and more of that. I think duplex, multi-family units, condominiums of various kinds, apartments. So it's about density, and municipalities, rather than the sprawl, are trying to focus on the older areas, for example, like East Olds. You'll see now that there's lots of the older homes that are beyond rehabbing are being sold to developers, and they're putting duplexes in them because the infrastructure is already there. So you can increase density just by doing that.
Okay.
It's all about density, in terms of taxation, in terms of developers. So the more people you can get per square foot, everybody wins. Whether condominium living is for everybody, that's a different question. Do you know what a condo is? Do you know the concept of a condominium? You own stuff as a group, and yet each condo has a board, and you as a condo owner have representation on that board, and that board does a financial plan, and then they assess each unit, the cost of insurance, sometimes includes water and sewer, insurance, maintenance and upkeep, and then you see, if you're looking for a condo, you'll see condo fees.
Yeah.
So you gotta really address, when you're from a buying perspective, what's included in the condo fees. And secondly, each condo administration will have what is called a reserve fund. You got to examine that reserve fund to see if there's enough money in the kitty for 5 years down the road when the roof needs replacing. Those kinds of things. So although condominiums are becoming more and more prevalent, yes, then you really got to be careful on what kind of a unit you get into, and make sure you do your homework on the particular complex. What are you smiling about? You just bought one.
No, but you said they're kind of a pain in the butt, because then condos are great for having a small area, but then you have to go through your whole board in order to do anything with it. There's downfalls to condos.
Well, there's rules for sure. Like most condos you can't change the exterior. You can't do anything. If you got a balcony, there's things that you can and can't do in the balcony. You might be able to have a barbecue, but they may limit plants, for example. My daughter lives in a condo in downtown Vancouver, and it's very restrictive. It's quite amazing. But they're a young couple in their 40s. This was a way that they could get into ownership. Maybe it's the first step in getting single family. My doubt is that that'll ever happen because the cost of real estate in Vancouver is so excessive.
Crazy.
So they have learned firsthand about how condominiums work and what you can and can't do. The reserve fund, they've discovered that now. I advise them, and they are. My daughter is getting on the board. So yeah, and to take yours a little bit further, if you choose to get on a buy a condominium down the road, get on the board. One way of influencing this decision process.
So everywhere you go, probably not across Canada, but maybe lots of parts of Canada, obviously land prices are on the rise. You know, incredibly expensive, especially if we look here in Alberta. You know, any half an hour drive within any major city, the land is pretty crazy.
Land, you mean agricultural land?
Well, if you were to buy like a little acreage or whatever, you know, the little dream like everyone has.
Yeah.
So I wonder if indirectly that increase in land price will help or solve the need to grow up instead of out, because nobody will be able to afford that single family detached home, which will then drive
On 4 or 5 acres. Is that what you're saying?
yeah. So now that drives the condo, high-rise, whatever market, however you want to call it, which then means you're growing up more, and you know what I mean? I wonder if one drives the other, if this a byproduct of this expensive land will actually help us in the long run.
I don't know. That's a tough question to answer. From my experience in rural real estate, a lot of buyers will buy a quarter and then try to subdivide a 5 acre parcel or whatever it is off the quarter to reduce their input cost. However, when they go to resell it, that their quarter is going to be discounted because you've taken the cream out. Because you've already done the subdivision, so when you go on the resale market, your 150 acres, it will be discounted accordingly. So the acreages, yeah, I know it's a dream. I mean, everybody thinks that it's all peaches and cream, but I mean, you can't just call up the town foreman and expect him to come out and clean the sewer or fix the water. I mean, you got to be self-sufficient because you are on your own. All that infrastructure that you expect to be provided in the city, you're paying for it.
It's on your shoulders.
I think the dream of the younger couple to be able to buy that 5 acre parcel with a nice home on it. I mean, you've got to be in this area, and Kristen, you're a farm girl. You're up to, I would say, your minimum of 300,000 just to buy a parcel of land. Then you got to drill well and all the rest of it on top of it.
Yeah.
So that dream is, man, it's getting tougher and tougher, unless they're, a professional couple maybe, and somebody's making big bucks, or they both big bucks. It's pretty tough. Well, it is to buy any home, as a matter of fact. I mean, it's just getting tougher and tougher. The new home market is especially the higher end stuff. It's really, the price pyramid. As you go up in price, so do down here are the buyers, and so if you keep going up, the price pyramid suggests the houses at the top also means that there's less buyers in that market. So it applies to all real estate, not just high-end homes. So go ahead.
Okay, so out of curiosity, since you're also in retail, what do you think about the tiny houses, that idea?
I would have trouble adjusting to that personally. Yeah. I think for some people it's a fantastic alternative. Do you mean the ones that are on wheels or the ones that can go on a permanent foundation? Because I've seen both.
I've seen both, but I don't know.
I think it's a tremendous concept for those people who can stand to live in that confined space.
Yeah.
And my understanding of the financing rules is that you would have to put on a permanent foundation. Mm-hmm. So you'd have to
find a lot.
Or you can also, in the mobile home parks, if you're on you have to get a personal loan as opposed to a mortgage if it's on blocks. If it's on a permanent foundation, if it's on piles and welded or strapped somehow to be fixed to the property, then you can get a long-term mortgage. So I suspect with the tiny homes, it'll be mostly, I would suspect, they may be, I don't know of any mobile home parks. Maybe it's the next developing market, I don't know. There's none that are available in this town I know of. I'm not aware of any parks that would allow that. You would have to, my guess is you would have to develop subdivisions that would accommodate the tiny home, tinier than what's, say, in this town in Destination Place. And I would think the mortgage boys would have to wrap their heads around resale and all that kind of
It
stuff.
seems to be becoming very popular.
It's certainly a trendy
Which
thing.
is,
Yeah.
I only know about what I've seen on television, you know.
Yeah.
There's a couple of not movies, but
Shows.
stations that
Yeah.
talk about that. Well, again, it's density.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe that's, you know, if you were to live in, why don't you lobby Airdrie? It would develop a subdivision that caters to that. I know there's a fellow out of Strathmore, I remember, is trying to get financing and stuff to build his. So, yeah, I mean, there's a market.
Thought about that, yeah.
You got the next best idea. Just develop the land and go after them. George will lend you the money.
There you go, partnership.
So tell us a little bit about the Olds Institute. What is it all about?
Okay, I'll go back in history. I'm sorry to do this historical thing. When I was downsized or right-sized, I kind of ignored the town for a couple of years. And then I thought, that's stupid. You should try to get involved. So I got it on the, they had a kind of an economic development committee, and I volunteered to sit on it. And in the course of the deliberations with that committee, it came up with that we needed some form of long-term economic development effort that possibly could be divorced from the tax base. In other words, a standalone organization that wouldn't depend on funding from a town and therefore be independent of the changes in political philosophy or whatever. So we hired a consultant, and he came up with this idea, which eventually became the Olds Institute, that we'd create a volunteer-based, primarily economic development initiative that would be responsible, at least in the initial stages, for economic development. So kind of almost like a, not technically a transfer, but a sharing, moving from town only to a volunteer group who would promote economic development and social programs in the community. So the Olds Institute was created, I'm trying to think, about 15 years ago, I think it was. And it's, at the time, it was totally volunteer-based. The president of, there was four, they were called essential members, and they were seen as being the economic drivers in the community. So that's the town, the Ag Society, the Chamber of Commerce, and the college. So that group, and then there was, I think we had a board of 10 at the time, and then there was volunteers from the community. And so that started the process. And one of the people on the board at the time was named Joe Gustafson. He was a pharmacist here in town. Had read about this notion of the SuperNet, this big pipe that was going from Edmonton to Calgary and beyond. But again, it was bypassing goals. How do we take advantage of it? So a technology committee was created to investigate a fiber to the premise, a fiber optic cable network to be implemented throughout town. And that evolved into ONET and where we are today. But then they got into, another committee was established to look at physician recruitment, because it's not easy to attract qualified physicians to a smaller center. So their job was to create an economic package to pitch to graduating medical students, for example. So that was one of the things. Then there was a community lifestyles committee looking at the kinds of things that could be developed and promoted in terms of just a living environment in this community and make that part of the package. So we've got a whole package of things that could be created that would provide information of various kinds, in my mind at least, to people wanting to live in Olds. So that's how the Institute evolved. It's become, ONED has become one of the primary things in my mind. So that was kind of the history of it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you were asking, George?
Yeah, and so most of it was volunteer driven.
Yep. However, a lot of its funding still comes from the town.
But kind of hands off.
Yeah. But the town's still directly involved, obviously. There's an opportunity for you guys to get involved. There's one of the things that the Chamber of Commerce and the Olds Institute are trying to promote is a series of self-help programs called, initiated by a guy by the name of Roger Brooks. And it's a self-help thing based on locally driven economic development. And he is, by way of examples, shown how communities throughout North America have used a bottom-up kind of concept to drive economic development. So definitely your age group, the fact that some of you may choose to live in Olds, I think it'd be a really neat thing for you guys to get involved with. And George. Is that, Kristen, is that the essence of the Olds Institute?
Well, that's a better description than I've heard yet.
So are there any other questions?
Got lots of time. Oh, God, it went fast. Holy mackerel.
Almost was thinking I'd have to put a stop to you.
Well, I am an old teacher. Well, former teacher. Old too. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
That was fun. Enjoyed it. And I encourage you, just as a parting word, no matter if it's Olds or whatever community you choose to ultimately reside in, get involved. It's your generation that's got to drive the next steps. And like you kind of commented, it's so important that young people get involved. All people, not just young people, that all sectors of our society get involved in thinking about where the kind of community you want to live in and implementing, influencing people to make decisions that will help drive whatever that vision might be. Because I think it's really important that the vision be locally driven as opposed to on high down.
We just have a small gift.
Oh, it is
Time.
small.
It's a gift card that you can
Tim's?
spend either at,
Oh,
no,
thank you.
it's an Olds College one.
Fantastic.
So either at the meat store, get yourself some barbecue meat there.
I'll think of
or-
you guys when I'm barbecuing.
Or at the campus store or at the brewery. Try some.
The brewery.
Try some Olds College beer.
That's another unique thing about Olds.
Thanks again very much.
Thanks, you guys. It's fun.
Thank you, yeah.